Hi, in this video I'm going to show you how to use the new texture painting tool set in the Gradientspace Toolbox, which is a plugin for Unreal Engine 5.3 to 5.5. You can find the Gradientspace Toolbox at gradientspace.com/UE-toolbox or on the Fab Marketplace from Epic Games. Just search for Gradientspace in the search bar and it'll come up. Okay, let's jump back to Unreal and let's get started. Okay, here we have a simple box primitive and I want to paint on this. Now if I just start the TexturePaint tool, I'm going to get this grid texture that I can't paint on because it just has a default, Unreal thing. So what I need to do first is I'm going to make a texture. So just to check, you can jump in the UV editor and see this, mesh has UVs laid out that are good for painting. Nothing's overlapping. There's gaps between them. So I'm going to use the Create Textures tool first. This is just a little utility that I made to let you create textures in the editor with different settings. So I can, change the resolution up here, easily skip between different power of 2 resolutions. And then there's settings here, basic settings for the texture. And there's some little shortcuts down here like sRGB color, linear color, EXR. If you want to make just like a grayscale texture, you can use single. And these just change the source format and compression mode of the texture. So we're going to do sRGB color. We're going to make sure that this new asset location is current folder because that's what it's going to make it down here. I'm going to click create texture and there's my new texture. And then I'm done this tool. So I'll just click complete. And now I need a material, but I can make that, just drag the texture on here and it's going to make a new material. And now I can paint on this, texture paint. And here we go. I can paint on this mesh. Now, So okay, let's start talking about the panel over here because that's where all the sort of action is. The active texture here, right? In this texture, I just have one. So I'm just going to show you on a different object here before we go on how you pick which texture you want to paint on. Because what the tool does when you start it is it looks at the materials on this object and it pulls out all the textures that it could possibly paint on. So here you see there's 5 different textures. Some of them don't make sense to paint on, like the first one here, this is says underscore normal, and it says the compression mode is normal map, so that's obviously the normal map for this. You can paint on normal maps with this tool, mostly only for erasing though. We've got the roughness map, some default grid texture, probably not actually used, displacement map that's probably not used, and then the albedo. So the base color or albedo is usually the sort of color material in something like a Quixel asset. So we just switch to that. See, this is an 8K map. It's very high res, but we can still paint on it pretty quick. You'll notice also the color here is a little changed, so the material might be shifting, stuff like that. One thing you can do to see the color more precisely is go into unlit mode, and you'll see that the blue is much closer because you're not seeing like effects of the PBR shading and stuff like that. Currently in this tool, you can only see the composited final material with that texture change. You can't see just the specific texture. You just have to make a new material if you want to do that from the texture. That's a feature that will get added soon. Okay, but let's not actually work on this one because it's too complicated to see what's happening. So let's jump back into the TexturePaint tool on this default cube. Okay, so like I said, we're going to go through the panel here. I'm just going to mention a little bit about up top here. So this little info here, you can hover, it shows you the texture where it is in your content browser, the material that you're painting relative to, the material isn't modified except that the texture changes. Information about the source format, this is the uncompressed format of the texture. That's what we paint into. And then there's the compressed format, which is like platform specific compression. We don't live paint the compressed format. We can't do that. So that is going to have some effects later, but while you're painting in this source format. And then you can expand the advanced. This just shows the same information. You can also change if you want to see like nearest filtering. I'll show that in a different, I'll show that a little bit more later. Okay, and then the next section here, we've got the color. So simple kind of stuff. There's the painting. Let's go to unlit just so we don't have effects of lumen and things like that. So that's the paint color. Shift does the secondary, which says it's a race color. You can pick, there's no tooltip down here to show you, but Shift G picks the current color as the paint color. And I think it's Control-Shift-G picks the secondary color. So if I want to do erase to that black there, I could do Control-Shift-G, click, and then Shift erase to the background. Gonna reset those. That doesn't really matter what this is set to. Underneath that, we have a little palette here. So if I was to go through different colors, maybe I want to try different shades. You see those colors I select here are going to appear in that palette. It was like a quick select, and then I can jump between them. And shift clicking sets it as the erase color. Okay, so that's the color selection, pretty basic right now. Then we've got the brush settings. So there's the area type, volumetric, and connected. If you've used the sculpting tools in modeling mode, you're familiar with these. So volumetric paints in a kind of sphere, and connected paints just in the area that's geometrically connected to the brush. So if you wanted to paint like a bunch of assembly of rocks, you can use volumetric mode to make strokes across them. But if you were in connected mode, you'd only paint the rock that's currently getting hit under the cursor. On this cube here, it doesn't really make any difference. We're not going to worry about it. You've got the brush size right now. It's just a relative 0 to 1. You got the fall off. So, low fall off paints very sharp stamps, and high fall off paints really smooth ones. And then we've got the flow rate. Flow rate is a little fuzzy what it does. It's basically like how much each stamp gets stamped. So if you turn it down, it sort of paints real slow. And if you crank it up, it paints sort of normal, like full painting kind of. There's lazy brush, so if I want nice smooth strokes, I can do that. And then, even with a mouse, you can make really smooth paths. And then there's the spacing setting. So the spacing is basically how far each brush stamp, how far you have to move to for each stamp to happen. And it's easy to see this if we turn up the alpha, or turn down the alpha. So we'll make this a little bit transparent, and we'll turn the fall off really low. So we're just painting kind of semi-transparent circles. So you can see, if I make, you can see that there, as I start, there are individual circles being stamped into the brush. So if I turn that spacing down to 0, you won't really see the circles anymore. If you turn that spacing up really high, they're almost generated as like kind of just barely touching. It's never completely perfect, although if you turn on lazy brush, it can get pretty good where they're almost exactly touching. So that's what the spacing is for. And that affects spacing and flow rate combined, kind of affect how quickly the brush paints. So I want to just put all these settings back now. Okay, actually, I didn't want to put all the settings back. Let's turn that fall off back off. So one thing to note is that I've got my alpha here. You see it's accumulating to full white as I paint, because the stamps are kind of applying on top of each other. So let's just skip the stamp settings here for now. We'll go down to stroke alpha. So what you can also do, in addition to the color alpha per stamp, you can set an alpha for the whole stroke. So I could put this down to like around 0.5. And now, no matter how much I paint, it's never going to go above sort of 0.5 alpha in this stroke. So what this is doing is essentially each stroke is painting kind of into a layer, a temporary layer, and then the whole stroke, every frame, is getting composited with the underlying texture until you let go of the mouse, and then it combined. So that's why if you do additional strokes, it's going to paint over top. So that just is a nice thing to have, especially if you want to paint kind of like masks or something like that, where maybe you want to set specific alpha values there for the mask painting. You can set a channel mask, RGBA, to which channels you want to paint into. In this case, this texture is solid, so there's no real alpha. This is sort of, you have to think about the separate alpha for the texture alpha versus the painting alpha is how much the color you're setting gets composited into the other texture. So if you want to paint into a channel that has, or into a texture that is being used as an alpha mask, you'd turn on this alpha, but by default it's not enabled, because generally you want a solid background and not to have this color alpha affect the background alpha. There's also some region filters, so especially because this is set to volumetric, if I paint near the edge, it's going to go across a little easier to see in lit mode. And so if I don't want that to happen, I can turn on the UV island filter, and then I can only paint in my UV island. And it's the same with polygroups. So this mesh actually has polygroups. I think they're set up. Yeah, there's like 4 quads on each face. Here, if I just click accept, you can see that. I think if I go to this, oh no, that's a static mesh, so you can't see the polygroups. Anyway, we'll skip that for now, but just trust me, each face is split into 4 polygroups, and that's why you got that crisp edge there. So you can use polygroups as a kind of masking if you want to have some real tight control over which texels get painted. So that's polygroup. Now there's 2 other features here, and then we'll go back to stamps. Okay, there's overlayer. So what's overlayer? This is, again, another sort of feature to help you paint masks and things like that. So when you enable overlayer, now we're painting into a separate layer on top. Here, let's just pick some other colors. That's getting composited with the underlying texture. Oh, it's because the stroke alpha is set up, right? So as I paint here, you know, I can do multiple strokes, and then I get these options to cancel or commit. So if I cancel that, that'll all just go away. So what that means, if I set this, if I want to paint some mask really precisely with a specific value, and I don't want to have to do it all in one stroke, I can use the overlayer, turn on the overlayer, you know, very carefully. Oh no, sorry, I did it wrong here. I want to leave this stroke alpha high and set this layer alpha. So this is like setting the alpha of a layer in Photoshop. So if I want it, you know, I can set that, paint my mask really carefully. It's going to show it as the full thing, but then when I commit, oh no, it didn't work. Oh, now it did. That seems like a bug. So I'm going to look into that. But what you should see is the same as the stroke alpha. When I paint with the layer alpha, let's just see if that's a TexturePaint. Turn this down. Nope, it's a bug. Okay, I think I got to fix. And then there is compression preview. So I'm just going to show you that. We need to make a very tiny brush. It's a little tricky to see this. What if we just paint some blue next to it? Oh, it's not going to work. So what the compression preview does is it shows you, it dynamically does the whatever compression mode is enabled, and then it lets you see what the texture is going to look like under that compression mode. So if you're familiar with texture compression, you know that like if we could make the brush small enough to do like a checkerboard pattern and we turn on compression, you're going to see that some of the colors in the checkerboard would change because of how texture compression works. I just can't think of a way to quickly make an example that's going to show that. But that's what that's for. So that's just a little useful thing. Okay, now when I started this video, which is a bit off the cuff, I forgot to import an example stamp. So I'm just going to do that and then come back and show you the brush stamp settings. Okay, and we're back. I made a little example to show you the thing that just didn't work. So this is just 3 pixels here. I painted red, green, and blue. I'll just show you this thing I skipped before, which is the filter mode. So I can toggle, say, into nearest filtering. Now you can see each texel. That's a kind of a useful thing sometimes, because if the texture is really distorted, you'll see like where texels might be really big. So you can see here in the uncompressed sort of paintable version, that red, green, and blue perfectly represented. If we toggle on compression preview, you see that the colors change, and you can see here, you know, this smooth gradient, the gradient changes. So that's all the effects of the texture compression. So that can be useful. You can't paint, if you try painting, it's going to turn it off because we can't live compress the texture as you paint it currently. Something to look into. But it can be useful if you want to just tweak things to maybe get the compressed version be a bit smoother. Okay, so now let's do a stamp. So the texture tool, it doesn't directly use texture 2Ds as stamps directly. So this asset picker is empty right now. But what I've done here, I've got a texture. So the stamps are based on textures, but you have to make a separate asset, and that is because we're going to do a lot with this in the future. But basically, you right-click on that texture, you're going to see this option, Create Gradientspace Stamp, and that's going to make this stamp asset. Now the stamp asset, it has a texture assigned to it. It has a color mode, so you could say, what that lets you do is say how you want to use this stamp. So maybe you want to use this texture and you just want to use a specific channel from that texture as an alpha value for, just the transparency of a solid color stamp, or you want to use it with a specific channel as the alpha channel. Maybe you want to just use like red as alpha and you're going to use that to paint grayscale, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of options I want to put in here, including maybe some procedural type stuff. But for now, it's very basic, just like one texture. Oh, and being able to have like multiple textures that could paint into, like the stamp could have a roughness channel and stuff like that. Anyway, cool stuff maybe in the future. But for now, let's go back to TexturePaint. Now if I click on this drop down, you see the stamp is in there now. So the stamp asset there, I'm going to pick that and make my brush size bigger. And there we go, it's stamping it. Now here you see it's sort of cutting off at the corners because it's a circle. So you can enable ignore fall off, because it's basically that stamp is still getting this fall off applied to it. So if I set that, you'll see it's even kind of fading out. So if we turn off ignore fall off, that's not going to happen anymore. There's a line to stroke. Oh, so the only problem with that is if there's no alpha in this, when I made this texture, I didn't set a background alpha, so it's solid black. So let's, well, that's a little weird, but you can see what's happening. I guess we turn up the spacing. And we can turn ignore fall off. So here it's following my brush, like it's kind of aligning with the brush. There you can see the square black background. Should have thought of that before I started. I can turn off align to stroke, and then it's going to stay screen aligned, so all is kind of pointing upwards. So that's the stamping. So it's a little basic right now. You'll notice that like the sampling of the thing is not amazing, the downsampling. So that's something that's going to get improved. But otherwise, you can use this, with any sort of custom stamp image. Okay, now I'm just going to show you the PixelPaint tool, but I'm just going to make something that would be a good example for that, and then I'll be back. Okay, so this is a model grid object. This is one of the other big features of the plugin, where these are like dynamically editable sort of grid cells that you can, cut corners off of and stuff like that. And we have this nice grid to mesh tool, which can do this kind of texture pack UV mode called face pixels pack. I'm going to say leave that at 4, and you'll see. So if I do that now, I've got this object, and it actually made a texture that I went through that quick. I'll do a video about model grids, but it actually made a texture and a material that's assigned to this. So I can texture paint on this too. You see it's very coarse because I left that setting at 4. So basically each box got allocated 4x4 grid of texels in this texture. So we've got this PixelPaint tool, which is works very similar to, oh, I had the wrong thing selected. Oh, this error message up here is wrong. I don't know why it's showing that. Don't worry about that for now. It's similar to TexturePaint, but it only paints individual texels at a time. So, on this box I had over here, it's not that useful because I can only set like individual dots. It could be useful sometimes. But on something that's got a textures kind of set up for low res, surface pixel art, this is a nice tool to do that kind of stuff. So it's got a simpler interface, same kind of thing, paint colors, and it just has the alpha. Some of the other features of TexturePaint will make their way over here, like the overlayer and things like that. But I just wanted to show this because this is there too, and I'm really interested in feedback on what you would like this tool to be able to do, because I'm kind of familiar with texture painting, not super familiar with pixel art, or how you might want to do this kind of, you know, surface pixel art, which I think is pretty cool. It works on the diagonal faces and stuff like that too. They get allocated, you know, usually the bottom, some row is a little bit smaller with that UV layout that I did. Okay, so that's the end of this video. Thanks for watching. Now I hope you know how to use the TexturePaint tools, and you can make awesome textures in Editor for all the cool stuff you modeled in modeling mode, and all sorts of other utility stuff too. And so yeah, leave me feedback in the comments if you have feature requests. Thanks for watching. Wait, I'm back. I remembered one thing that I forgot to show you. I did kind of show you, but I didn't use it. So you know, when we were doing this stamping and the texture painting, we had this problem that the texture didn't have a colored background or alpha transparent background. So we could use that thing I showed before, this these settings on the stamp. That's why they're there. It's because maybe I can't change this image. So what I could do is just do channel as alpha and say use the red channel. You know, because white, it doesn't matter. Now if I go back into TexturePaint and I've got that stamp, the stamps, oh, it's blue. So it's multiplying by my current color. So if I set that to black, it's going to paint black. When I set it to white, it's going to paint white, right? Because it's just using that red channel as the alpha and multiplying it with my current color. So that's a real handy thing to let you make stamps for this painting tool. Okay, for real now, it's the end of the video. Thanks for watching.